This is a dear friend, James Naismith III, and he's got a story to tell you. Some of you know this story. I've told you over the years. However, I'll let you hear the story from Dr. Naismith himself. This is James Naismith III, and the story of how basketball started.
Well, I'll be happy to tell you what I know about it, which is a little bit anyhow. Basketball, of course, was created by a gentleman who was of Scottish heritage. Both of his parents were born and raised in Scotland. Came into Canada to establish a new life, and he was born in 1861, the middle child in a three-child family. And things were going well, and I'm sure he learned a lot from his parents in those first 9 years. And the reason I know that is because, unfortunately, he lost both of his parents to a disease, typhoid fever, within 2 weeks. They both died, and he was left with a grandmother. But then she lost her health, and within another 2 years or so, he and his older sister and younger brother were taken in by a bachelor uncle on his mother's side. And I mention that because a bachelor uncle is not going to know a lot about raising kids. I'm sure he did the best he could, but that leaves a huge hole in your life to lose your parents at that age. I think it's important because at that point he had to make some decisions. And I think the outcome of that decision was basically probably from what his dad had told him, is that a man's job is to take care of his family. Well, he realized now that his family was himself, his older sister, and his younger brother. And when he started the high school, he was thinking about that, and he thought, there is no way I can work enough to make enough money to take care of my family and go to high school at the same time. I've got to go to work. And he worked for Uncle Pete, but he also worked in the lumber industry because the lumbering was a big job. This is in Ontario, in Canada, and he could work all year. And I'm thinking, well, working farming in the winter, there's not a lot to do. You got to feed the stock and so forth. But how in the world do you do lumbering in the winter? And I asked a question of somebody that was Canadian. They knew the answer. He said, well, Jim, think about it. It says you can drag a log, lumbering, with horses, which is all they had, through ice and snow, but you can't drag it through mud. And that's a lot of the rest of the time in the forest. So he understood. So he kept at the lumbering business, and then I got a story from an older lady that was fascinated by my granddad's life and had written down a lot of what she'd heard from him and the family about his life, and shared that with me. And part of that story was that it put him in the bar, probably on payday, with some money in his pocket, and probably drinking too much. And there was a man there at the other end of the bar that nobody seemed to know. He was an older man, but nobody knew who he was. But he knew who my granddad was, and he said, and used my granddad's mother's name. Says, well, is she your mother? And he said, yes, she is. And he said, well, she would roll over in her grave if she saw you now. And the impact of that, I'm sure, caused him change in his life plan again. And now it was not whether or not to go back to school, but get back to school and get your education done. Of course, he talked to Uncle Pete, and he arranged to go back to high school. And when he told them he wanted to be enrolled in high school, they knew the history. And I think they were a bit ticked off at him. And they said, well, it's going to take you 4 years to finish high school, and he's already 20 years old. That's a long time if you're 20 and wanting to move ahead. And he said, I'm going to do it. Well, that tells you a little bit more about Granddad. He was a man that when he decided he's going to do something, he's going to do something. It's going to get his full power and attention. And the proof of that was that going in with not a good, and he didn't look too good to them going in, but within 2 years he'd already finished all of the studies for his high school degree. Plus, the last half of that last year, he took in teaching a class that the teacher became so sick he couldn't continue, and they couldn't find another replacement. So in that 4 years, he finished, or 2 years, he finished 4 years of high school and taught for half a year. And then he determines he wants to continue his education, and went to McGill University. His Uncle Pete agreed and said, if you continue to work for me on the farm, when we can work on the farm, he said, I'll help you go to school. And I'm sure he did in some fashion. Granddad went to Canada, the city in Canada, in Montreal, and McGill University, or college, I guess, McGill. And he got a 4-year degree, AB degree, which is either Bachelor of Arts or possibly more likely in a way connected with sports, because he loved the sports. That was his granddad. Well, he got that degree, and then he decided he had the opportunity to continue his education by going to the Presbyterian School of Preaching, which had some management agreements with McGill University, and came out with a 3-year degree, which would be the equivalent, I think, of a doctorate, but it would allow him to be ordained in the Presbyterian Church as a preacher. And this is all this same kid that, that he's still pushing ahead. My dad had mentioned that at that stage of his life, he took time to go out in Western Canada, kind of a missionary outreach. And I got some more detail available on that. There was 3 years he was out there. And Dad suggested he probably ran into some problems having to do with churches, but it convinced him he probably ought to shift gears again. And he got talking to a dear friend, and a friend said, have you thought about the YMCA school, Young Men's Christian Association? And he said, tell me about it. And he did. He said, I'm interested. He said, well, look at the one in Springfield, Massachusetts. It's doing a good job. The school at that time, the name of the one in Springfield was it was YMCA school, training school, and he was, of course, that's exactly what he wanted. And he visited with them. They agreed to take him in as a student. And but with his degrees already, he was also teaching. So he was both a teacher and a student while he was at that school. It was the School for Christian Workers at that time, a YMCA, Christian for Christian Workers. I've always liked that old title because it wasn't believers, it was workers. And they are kind of tied together.
True.
So, yeah. So he did very, very well there. And then continuing his path, he went from there. He got married. Well, first thing he did before he got married was he was instructed by his director there at the school to develop something that the young men could do during some of the miserable winter weather when you just couldn't play outside. And he said, they're going to tear the building apart. They got too much energy and not enough to do. Come up with something that'll keep them busy. He had a class of 18, and he started off modifying the other sports, hockey and all the other sports really, but they didn't like anything he did. And I have a copy of some of his handwritten notes written about the night that he finally got on track. And he used the phrase, he said, that I became philosophical. Well, what he meant as philosophical is I began to use my head. I began to think. And he said, they'll never like it's a modified version of sports they already love. That's never going to work. So I've got to start from scratch. And so, okay, let's start from scratch. Well, we need a sport. So number one, it's got to have a ball. All the sports he knew had a ball or a hockey puck or something that you could throw, hit with a stick, hit with, whatever. Well, the second thing you have to have is a goal. You got to put it someplace to get a score. And what his thinking started says, how about all the old sports that I love? Says, well, all of the goals are vertical, like a net or something like that. A hockey puck has got something to drive it into. They're all vertical, and the harder you throw the ball or hit the puck or whatever, the better your chance of scoring. I've got to take that force out of it because you can't play with that kind of force in the basement with concrete or brick floors and brick walls and steel columns and everything in the world in the way. So he said it's got to be a horizontal goal, and that came from a childhood game, Duck on a Rock, where the effective shot to win the game was an arching shot, not a throw it as hard as you can shot. And so, okay, now he's got the arching shot. He knows it won't work at the ground level. You're just too easy to guard. You got to move it up. And he looked at the rail that was around the balcony that surrounded where they were playing, which was really basement level of where they were playing, and the street level where the balcony was. And he said, that's going to be high enough. And he talked to the janitor. He said, I need a couple of boxes. Do you have some? And he said, I don't know. Let me go take a look. So he did, and he came back and he said, Mr. Naismith said, I don't have a couple of boxes, but I came up with a couple of baskets. Will those work? And well, Granddad looked at them, and they're big enough at the top, and they're sloped to where they nose down, and so it'll catch the ball, and it's going to be obvious when you make a goal. So he said, yeah. He said, those peach baskets, they'll work just fine. He said, let's just put them up there on the rail, and that's where the 10 feet came from. And then that'll be the goal. And so now he's got his basic rules all in his head, and he gets his class together, 9 on each side, and said, okay, here's the game. And he showed him the ball, and he pointed out the goals. And the way to score is you have to get the ball in your opponent's goal, which means you got to shoot it up there, and it's got to be an arch shot. You can't throw it past it. You got to get it in it. And they understood. That's pretty simple. So he said, I picked up a whistle and blew the whistle and threw the ball out, and the guys got it, and man, they went at it, and pretty soon I looked out there, and I got a pile of young men out in the middle of the floor. And I said several bruises, one dislocated shoulder, one guy knocked completely out. And the interviewer that heard this from him, this was later, toward the end of his life, really, he said, well, weren't there any rules? And he said, that's where I made my big mistake. I didn't have enough rules. So I went back and I wrote some more. I think he said 3 more. He said, because the most important of the 3 of the new rules is now rule number 3. You can't run with the ball. That's where the force was coming from. So he took that out. So now it was a passing game where it was finally passed to somebody that could make a goal. And since it was a basket, the only way you get the ball back in is to get somebody to lean over the rail up above and grab it out and throw it back down again. So it's kind of a slow game. Dribbling came about fairly quickly. And Granddad kind of jokingly said, well, it's always been in the rule. It's a way around the rules. Says you you can't throw it to somebody else, but you sure enough bounce it to yourself. But it was included in the rule. And he said, then we had a really good game. Well, that was this interview. It was in New York City at the big gymnasium there. And then the story simply goes on from there. And he very quickly lost any control of the rules because it's just too popular. And it went worldwide immediately. That's a fascinating thing. It went to Japan and China,
Wow.
both.
Really?
Within a year,
Really?
they were being played. And
what year did it start?
This was 1891 that he invented it,
My goodness.
and by the 1892s, it was already been played in those two. And I found out there were other countries that picked it up too, but that came from the YMCA experience because it was international.
My
And
goodness.
they had people from Japan in school in Springfield, and when they went home, they took the game with them.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah,
I
and-
didn't even know about that part
Yeah,
of the
well, I
story.
didn't either.
Wow.
Till I
Okay.
started researching, and then it just continued to spread. It's
Right.
the second most popular game in the world now,
Wow.
and it's bumping to be number one.
Yeah.
My dad suggested he's good Scottish Presbyterian background. He didn't waste a lot of money. I can
Right,
testify to that.
Yes, having been married into a Scottish family, I do understand Scottish frugalty. Well, and we had a delightful day. I'll tell you about the Naismith family. I've known them since before I was born.
Oh, well, they got a new one coming. We could tell.
Or they knew me. Anyway, so the Naismiths went to the Air Street Church that supported my parents in Brazil, and Jim was an elder, came down to Brazil, and so we would come back on furloughs. We would stay with the Naismiths. His daughter Ann and I were friends, Richard and Jim, and Andrea and Margaret, and then Robert, their son. So we did a lot with the Naismiths. And when we moved back in '75, we lived in Corpus for 2 months, and they welcomed us. So it's been since '75 since I've seen this lovely family.
We shared families.
We've shared families. And so I came up, I called Ann. I talked to Ann 3 years ago. And last week I texted and said, I'm in Boston. You should come up and we should go to the Hall of Fame. Well, then she said, my parents are there next week for the enshrinement. So today I'm going to have to let Mr. Naismith go because they've got to go to ceremonies. And this is the big enshrinement where they will be, inducting the class of 2022 at the Hall of Fame. And so we saw Bill Walton and I don't know who else. There were they did some inaugurations, and so it was really fun. So I'm going to let them go. They've got to go. But thank you so much. It was so good to see you. And my friends will enjoy this story. They've been hearing about it for decades. So thank you. Okay, we love the Naismiths. Take care.
Appreciate it. It's so good to visit with you again.
You too.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.